Texas, August 1943. When the cattle trucks converted into prisoner transports rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, the German soldiers inside pressed their faces against the wooden slats, squinting through the dust at something none of them had ever seen before. Cowboys. Real American cowboys, sitting on horseback along the fence line, watching with curious eyes beneath wide-brimmed hats that looked like something from the Wild West films they'd seen in Berlin movie theaters years ago. Among the prisoners was Heinrich Hank Weber, a 26-year-old mechanic from Munich who had been captured in North Africa. As he stepped down from the truck, his legs shaky from the long journey, he stared at a cowboy who tipped his hat in what seemed like a greeting. "Mein Gott," Heinrich whispered to his fellow prisoner, "are those real hats?" Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we retell the forgotten human stories of war. The August heat hit them like a wall of fire, but it wasn't the temperature that made Heinrich's heart race. It was the unexpected sight before him. This wasn't the brutal prison camp he'd imagined during those long, dark nights crossing the Atlantic in the ship's belly. Instead of barbed wire and guard towers, he saw simple wooden fences, canvas tents arranged in neat rows, and something that made him blink twice, a baseball diamond carved into the red Texas dirt. The air smelled of mesquite smoke, and something else he couldn't identify, leather and horses and wide-open spaces. The camp commander, Colonel James Mitchell, a tall man with kind eyes and a slight limp from the Great War, stepped forward to address the new arrivals. "Gentlemen," he said in clear English, knowing some of them understood, "you are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings. You will be treated as such." Heinrich caught most of the words and translated quietly for those around him who spoke only German. The other prisoners looked skeptical. They'd heard stories about American brutality, about camps where men disappeared. But as Heinrich looked around, he noticed something strange. The guards weren't holding their rifles ready. They were relaxed. What Heinrich didn't know yet was that Camp Hearn sat in the heart of Texas ranch country, where the local cowboys and ranchers had volunteered to help with the camp operations. These weren't military men in the traditional sense. They were horsemen, rope handlers, men who understood that respect was earned through actions, not fear. Tom "Dusty" Rodriguez, a third-generation cowboy whose family had worked these lands since before Texas was a state, had been watching the German prisoners arrive with genuine curiosity. He'd fought in France in the last war and knew that the enemy soldiers were often just boys, far from home, scared and confused, as the prisoners were led to their quarters. Simple but clean canvas tents with wooden floors and real beds. Heinrich caught sight of something that would change everything. In the distance, beyond the camp's boundary, a cowboy was working with a wild horse, not breaking it with force, but gently coaxing it, speaking in low, patient tones. The horse, initially resistant, gradually began to respond. Heinrich, who had grown up in the city but had always dreamed of wide spaces and freedom, watched mesmerized. The cowboy noticed his attention and, after securing the horse, walked over to the fence. "You like horses, son?" the cowboy asked in English, his voice carrying the slow, musical drawl of East Texas. Heinrich understood enough to nod. The cowboy smiled, a genuine, warm expression that Heinrich hadn't seen directed at him since before the war began. "Name's Dusty," the cowboy said, touching the brim of his hat. "Maybe tomorrow, if your colonel don't mind, I'll show you how we do things around here." As Heinrich was led away to evening roll call, he kept looking back at the cowboy and the horse, wondering if this strange American was serious, or if it was just another kind of psychological warfare he'd never encountered before. The morning sun was already merciless by 7 o'clock when Heinrich heard his name called for work detail. He'd spent a restless night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Texas countryside. Coyotes howling in the distance, the gentle lowing of cattle, and something he'd never heard before, the night song of crickets so loud it seemed like nature's own orchestra. As he emerged from his tent, squinting in the bright light, he saw Dusty Rodriguez waiting by the camp gate with several other local men, all wearing those impossibly wide hats and holding tools. "Morning, Heinrich," Dusty said, pronouncing the name carefully with respect. Heinrich was startled. How did this American know his name, and why was he being so friendly? Colonel Mitchell appeared beside them, coffee cup in hand, looking surprisingly relaxed for a military commander. "Weber," the colonel said, "Mr. Rodriguez here has requested you specifically for fence repair detail. Seems he noticed you watching his horse work yesterday." Heinrich's English was limited, but he caught the important parts. Work, detail, fence repair. And somehow this cowboy had asked for him personally. As they walked beyond the camp's perimeter, Heinrich felt a strange sensation he couldn't immediately identify. It took him several minutes to realize what it was. He wasn't afraid. The guards weren't pointing guns at him, the cowboys weren't treating him like a dangerous animal, and Colonel Mitchell had simply nodded and wished them good work. In his experience of war, prisoners were either ignored or brutalized. This casual kindness was completely outside his understanding of how enemies behaved toward each other. Dusty led him to a section of fence where a recent storm had knocked down several posts. "See, the thing about Texas," Dusty explained, gesturing broadly at the landscape, "is that everything here has to be strong enough to handle whatever nature throws at it. Wind, rain, heat, drought, rattlesnakes and cattle with more attitude than sense." He handed Heinrich a post-hole digger and demonstrated the technique. But the secret isn't fighting the land, it's working with it. As Heinrich began to dig, Dusty continued talking, his voice patient and instructive. "In Germany, I bet you build things to last forever, solid as a mountain. Here, we build things to bend without breaking." The work was hard, but satisfying in a way that military drilling never had been. As the morning progressed, Heinrich found himself actually enjoying the rhythm of digging, setting posts, stretching wire. Dusty worked alongside him, not as a supervisor but as a partner, occasionally correcting his technique or showing him a more efficient method. When Heinrich struggled with a particularly stubborn post, Dusty didn't criticize or take over. Instead, he simply said, "That ground's been dry for 3 months. Pour some water on it first, let it soften." It was practical advice, not condescension. Around midday, when the heat became too intense for comfortable work, Dusty called for a break and produced a thermos of cold water and sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. "My wife Maria, she makes these," he explained, offering one to Heinrich. "Ham and cheese, nothing fancy, but she grows the tomatoes herself." Heinrich hesitated. Was this some kind of test? In the German army, fraternizing with the enemy was unthinkable, but his stomach was empty, and the sandwich smelled incredibly good. He took a careful bite, and his eyes widened in surprise. It was delicious, but more than that, it was normal. Just a man sharing his lunch with another man who was hungry. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories travel. The following week brought an invitation that Heinrich still couldn't quite believe was real. Dusty had approached Colonel Mitchell with a request that seemed absurd, even by Texas standards. Could some of the German prisoners learn rope work? "These boys are going to be here for a while," Dusty had explained to the colonel over coffee in the camp office. "Might as well teach them something useful. Besides, good ranch hands are hard to find, and some of these fellas have clever fingers." Colonel Mitchell, who had grown up on a farm in Iowa and understood the value of practical skills, had agreed with one condition. The lessons would be supervised, and any prisoner could refuse to participate. Heinrich was among the first to volunteer, along with Klaus Hoffmann, a former carpenter from Hamburg, and young Wilhelm Willi Schmidt, barely 19, who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht straight from his father's bicycle repair shop in Stuttgart. They gathered in the camp's central area, where Dusty had set up what he called a rope school, Several wooden posts at different heights and distances, with various types of rope and leather gear Heinrich had never seen before. "Now, boys," Dusty began, settling his hat more firmly against the morning breeze, "roping isn't about strength, and it sure isn't about fighting. It's about understanding." And he picked up a lariat, a beautiful piece of braided leather that seemed to flow like water in his experienced hands. "This here rope is going to do exactly what you tell it to do, but only if you ask it nice." The other cowboys who had come to help, old Pete Carson, whose weathered hands had been working cattle for 40 years, and young Bobby Martinez, whose grandfather had taught him rope tricks before he could walk, grinned at Dusty's teaching style. The first lesson was simply learning to hold the rope correctly. Heinrich, whose hands were accustomed to wrenches and engine parts, struggled with the feel of the braided leather. It seemed to have a life of its own, coiling and uncoiling in ways that defied logic. "Relax your grip," Dusty instructed, placing his own hands over Heinrich's to demonstrate the proper tension. "You're trying to control it like a machine, but rope is more like a dance partner. You got to lead, but gentle-like." Klaus, with his carpenter's understanding of materials and tension, caught on more quickly. Within an hour, he was making small, awkward loops that occasionally stayed open long enough to be called lassos. Willie, however, seemed to have a natural gift for it. His first successful throw, a perfect loop that settled neatly over a fence post 20 feet away, drew applause not just from the Cowboys, but from other German prisoners who had stopped their own activities to watch. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete Carson muttered, then caught himself and tipped his hat apologetically to Heinrich. "Pardon the language, son, but that boy's got the touch." Willie's face turned bright red with pride and embarrassment, but his grin was impossible to hide. For the first time since his capture, he had done something that earned praise instead of punishment, something that made others smile instead of frown. The rope lessons became a daily fixture at Camp Hearn. Word spread among the prisoners, and soon there were more volunteers than Dusty and his friends could handle. Colonel Mitchell, observing the positive effect on camp morale, authorized the expansion of the program. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," he told his staff, "but busy hands building something useful, that's rehabilitation." The Cowboys agreed to train more groups, and soon the sound of leather whistling through the air and the calls of "good throw" and "try again" became as much a part of the camp's daily rhythm as reveille and taps. What amazed Heinrich most wasn't just that he was learning a skill he'd never imagined needing. It was the way the Cowboys treated their mistakes. When his rope tangled or fell short, there was no anger, no punishment, just patient correction and encouragement to try again. "Hell, son," Bobby Martinez told him after a particularly frustrating afternoon. "I've been roping since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I still miss half the time. The cattle don't much care about your success rate. They just care that you don't give up trying." By September, something extraordinary was happening at Camp Hearn that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The German prisoners weren't just learning cowboy skills, they were teaching some of their own. It started when Klaus Hoffmann noticed that Dusty's favorite saddle had a broken stirrup leather that was being held together with wire and hope. The leather had cracked during the brutal August heat, and every cowboy who'd looked at it had declared it beyond saving. "Excuse me, Mr. Rodriguez," Klaus said in his careful English one morning after rope practice, "but I think I can fix that properly." What followed was an afternoon that changed the dynamic of Camp Hearn forever. Klaus examined the damaged leather with the careful eye of a craftsman, running his fingers along the grain, testing the flexibility of the undamaged portions. "In Hamburg," he explained to the gathered cowboys, "my father, he taught me leather work for the shipyards, different kind of leather, but same principles." From his limited personal belongings, Klaus produced a small toolkit that had somehow survived his capture. Awls, needles, and specialized cutting tools that made the cowboys whistle in appreciation. Dusty watched in fascination as Klaus demonstrated European leatherworking techniques that were completely foreign to the Texas methods. Where the Cowboys would have patched and reinforced with additional strips, Klaus carefully removed the damaged sections and rebuilt them using a weaving technique that actually made the repaired areas stronger than the original. "See here," Klaus explained, his English improving with his enthusiasm. "The stress, it must be distributed. Not fight the pressure, but guide it where the leather can handle it." The repair took 3 hours, during which a crowd of prisoners and cowboys gathered to watch. Klaus worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, occasionally asking for specific tools or explaining what he was doing to the fascinated audience. When he finally held up the finished saddle, even the skeptical old-timers had to admit it was the finest leather work they'd ever seen. "Damn, son," Pete Carson muttered, running his weathered hands over the invisible mend. "That's prettier than it was when it was new." Heinrich found his own opportunity to contribute when Bobby Martinez's truck broke down just outside the camp gates the following week. The 1939 Ford had been making ominous grinding noises for days, and Bobby had been nursing it along with prayers and curses in equal measure. When the engine finally gave up with a sound like a dying cow, Bobby kicked the front tire and unleashed a stream of creative profanity that impressed even the German prisoners, who didn't understand half the words, but recognized the universal language of mechanical frustration. The engine was making a sound that Heinrich recognized immediately, a timing issue that was common in the Opel trucks back home, but also occurred in American vehicles under certain conditions. The rhythmic knocking, combined with the way the engine died when Bobby tried to accelerate, pointed to a specific problem that Heinrich had diagnosed and repaired dozens of times in his father-in-law's garage before the war. "May I look?" he asked Colonel Mitchell, who was standing nearby with his hands on his hips, contemplating whether to call for a tow truck. Permission granted. Heinrich rolled up his sleeves and dove under the hood with the enthusiasm of a man returning to his natural element. His hands, which had grown soft during weeks of rope work, quickly remembered their old familiarity with engines. He traced fuel lines, tested connections, and listened to the engine's labored breathing with the concentration of a doctor examining a patient. "The timing chain," he announced after 20 minutes of investigation. "It has stretched. Also, carburetor needs adjustment, and fuel pump is weak." What followed was a masterclass in mechanical problem-solving that left the assembled cowboys shaking their heads in admiration. Heinrich didn't just fix the obvious problems, he diagnosed and corrected issues that Bobby hadn't even known existed. Working with tools borrowed from the camp's maintenance shed, Heinrich adjusted timing, rebuilt the carburetor from memory, and fashioned a temporary repair for the fuel pump using parts cannibalized from other machinery with Colonel Mitchell's bemused permission. The transformation was dramatic. When Heinrich finally stepped back and nodded to Bobby to try the ignition, the old Ford roared to life with a sound of power and smoothness that it hadn't possessed since leaving the factory. Bobby let out a whoop that could be heard across 3 counties, then immediately began testing the truck's acceleration, braking and steering, marveling at how much better everything felt. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he exclaimed. "This thing runs better than my daddy's new Chevrolet." The exchange of skills became unofficial, but invaluable. Word spread through the local community that the German prisoners weren't just learning American skills. They were sharing their own expertise with remarkable generosity. Willie, whose father's bicycle shop had taught him precision with small mechanical parts, became the camp's unofficial watch and clock repair specialist after helping Pete Carson fix a pocket watch that had belonged to Pete's father and hadn't run properly in 15 years. The watch repair became a weekly ritual. Every Saturday morning, local farmers and ranchers would arrive at Camp Hearn with broken timepieces, hopeful expressions, and small payments for the camp fund. Willie worked at a table set up in the shade of the camp's largest oak tree, his young fingers delicately manipulating springs and gears smaller than matchsticks. In return, Pete taught Willie the art of braiding leather, a skill that required the same careful attention to detail that bicycle chains demanded, but applied to creating beautiful, functional items that would last for decades. "You got good fingers, son," Pete observed one afternoon, watching Willie work on a particularly complex bridle design. "Steady hands and a patient mind. That's worth more than gold in this country. Hell, that's worth more than gold anywhere." The compliment brought a flush of pride to Willie's young face that reminded everyone present how far from home these prisoners really were and how hungry they were for approval and purpose. The language barrier, which had seemed insurmountable at first, began to dissolve through the universal communication of shared work and mutual respect. Heinrich learned that slicker-than-owl shit was actually a high compliment about his mechanical abilities, while Dusty discovered that das ist wunderbar meant his rope lessons were being deeply appreciated. They developed a unique pidgin of English, German, and Spanish that the camp guards started calling Text Deutsch, and it served them surprisingly well for complex technical discussions and simple human conversation alike. Klaus became the camp's unofficial translator, not just for language, but for cultural concepts that didn't easily cross borders. When Dusty mentioned missing his wife's cooking during roundup season, Klaus explained about German harvest festivals and how food connected people to home and family. When Heinrich expressed confusion about American casualness toward authority, Pete shared stories about frontier independence and why Americans had never been comfortable with rigid hierarchies. One afternoon, while working on fence repair in the growing autumn heat, Heinrich asked Dusty a question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Why are you so kind to us? We are your enemies. In Germany, we were told Americans hate all Germans, want to destroy our country completely." Dusty paused, considering his answer carefully while he adjusted his hat against the late afternoon sun. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of war and propaganda and personal experience. "Well, son, I figure it this way," Dusty finally replied, his voice thoughtful and measured. "Y'all didn't choose to come to Texas, and we didn't choose to have you here. But here we all are, so we can make the best of it or the worst of it, and life's too short to spend it being mean when you could be useful instead. Besides," he added with a slight grin, "my mama raised me to judge a man by what he does, not what uniform he wears." The conversation that followed, conducted in halting English with gestures and drawings in the dirt when words failed, opened Heinrich's eyes to a different way of thinking about conflict and humanity. Dusty told him about his own father, who had fought in the Great War and come home changed, haunted by memories that he rarely shared but that shaped his understanding of war's true cost. He used to say that every man he killed over there was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's father. Said it didn't make the war wrong necessarily, but it made it sadder than it had to be. Heinrich found himself talking about his own father, killed in the trenches of France in 1918. Leaving behind a widow and a young son who grew up wondering what kind of man his father had been. The parallel experiences, sons of men who had killed each other, now working together under the vast Texas sky, created a bond that transcended nationality and ideology. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts about fathers they'd barely known, and the strange cycles of history that had brought their sons together in friendship instead of enmity. Colonel Mitchell, who had been observing these interactions with growing interest and making detailed notes for his reports to Washington, made a decision that would define the rest of Camp Hearn's existence. He authorized the creation of formal skills exchange programs, pairing prisoners with local craftsmen and ranchers who needed help and were willing to teach. The program was voluntary on both sides, and it proved remarkably popular, with waiting lists of both prisoners and local volunteers. The pairing process became an art form in itself. Colonel Mitchell and his staff learned to match personalities as well as skills, understanding that successful collaboration required more than just technical compatibility. Heinrich was paired with Tom "Dusty" Rodriguez for advanced horsework, Klaus with Pete Carson for leather crafting and Willie with Bobby Martinez for mechanical training. Other prisoners found themselves learning carpentry, metalworking, cooking, and even basic veterinary skills from local experts who discovered that teaching was as rewarding as learning. "We're not fraternizing," the colonel explained to his superiors in a report that would later be studied by military historians and sociologists. "We're demonstrating that civilization survives even in wartime, and that enemies can lay down arms without laying down their humanity. These men will return to Germany someday with skills, experiences, and perspectives that could help rebuild their country in ways that serve everyone's interests." The skills exchange program became a model studied by other camps across the United States, but few achieved the same level of success. The unique combination of Texas hospitality, German work ethic, and enlightened military leadership had created something special at Camp Hearn, a place where the future was being built, one friendship, one lesson, one shared moment of understanding at a time. Christmas 1943 at Camp Hearn brought snow, an unusual gift in East Texas that transformed the camp into something that looked almost magical in the pale winter light. The red dirt roads became ribbons of white, the canvas tents wore caps of pristine snow, and the usual harsh edges of military life were softened by nature's unexpected decoration. Heinrich stood outside his tent on Christmas morning, watching snowflakes the size of silver dollars drift down from a pewter sky, feeling homesick for the first time in months. The snow reminded him of Christmas mornings in Munich, of his mother's strudel cooling on the kitchen windowsill, of church bells ringing across the city, and the warm glow of candlelight through frosted windows. He was lost in memories of home, wondering if his mother had enough food, enough warmth, enough hope to sustain her through another winter of war, when Dusty Rodriguez appeared beside him like a friendly ghost, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested he had something special in mind. The coffee was real American coffee, rich and strong, not the thin substitute that had become standard in wartime Germany. The warmth spread through Heinrich's hands and up his arms, a small comfort that felt larger than its simple reality. "You ever been on a horse, Heinrich?" Dusty asked, his breath visible in the cold air, forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry winter atmosphere. Heinrich shook his head, explaining in his improving English that horses had been luxury items in his working-class neighborhood, as foreign to his experience as flying machines or ocean voyages. His father had worked in a factory, his mother in a laundry, and their world had been one of streetcars and bicycles, not horses and wide-open spaces. "Well," Dusty continued, his voice carrying the special tone that cowboys reserved for important announcements, "it's Christmas, and I got permission from the colonel to teach you something special, something that'll stick with you long after this war's over and you go home to Germany. Consider it my Christmas present to you." What followed was a conversation about trust, patience, and the relationship between humans and animals that served as an unexpected introduction to philosophy as well as horsemanship. Dusty led Heinrich to a small corral behind the main camp area, where a gentle old mare named Rosie was waiting with the patience of a creature who had spent years teaching nervous beginners the basics of equitation. Rosie was a strawberry roan with kind eyes, and a temperament so calm that the local children used her for their first riding lessons. She had been donated to the camp by a nearby rancher whose daughter had outgrown her need for such a gentle mount, and she had become the perfect horse for introducing city-bred German prisoners to the mysteries of Western horsemanship. The sensation of being on horseback for the first time was unlike anything Heinrich had ever experienced. At first it was genuinely terrifying, sitting 8 feet off the ground on an animal with a mind of its own, muscles of its own, an agenda of its own seemed like madness disguised as recreation. His legs trembled against Rosie's broad sides, his hands gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity, and his entire body remained rigid with the expectation of imminent disaster. But Dusty's patient instruction and Rosie's steady temperament gradually gave Heinrich confidence. "Don't fight her," Dusty coached from his position beside the horse, one hand on Heinrich's leg, the other holding Rosie's lead rope. "Listen to her rhythm and move with it. A horse can tell if you're scared or angry or trying to control everything. They respond to calm confidence, not force. Think of it like dancing with a partner who weighs half a ton and has her own opinions about the music." The breakthrough came when Heinrich stopped trying to control every aspect of the experience and allowed himself to feel the horse's natural rhythm. Rosie's walk was a 4-beat gait that created a gentle, rolling motion once Heinrich learned to relax his hips and let his body follow rather than fight the movement. Gradually, his white-knuckled grip on the saddle horn relaxed into a more natural hold on the reins, and his rigid posture softened into something resembling actual riding. As Heinrich learned to trust Rosie, something deeper and more profound was happening. For the first time since his capture, perhaps for the first time since the war began, he felt genuinely peaceful. The horse's steady gait, the winter air cold and clean on his face, the vast Texas sky stretching endlessly overhead like a blue-gray dome of possibility, all combined to create a moment of pure, present tense existence. There was no past to regret and no future to fear, just the simple reality of man and horse moving together across the landscape in perfect, uncomplicated harmony. The riding lessons continued through the winter and into spring, becoming the highlight of Heinrich's week and a source of wonder for the other prisoners who gathered to watch his progress. Heinrich proved to be a natural horseman, developing an intuitive understanding of how to communicate with the animals that impressed even the most experienced cowboys. He learned to read a horse's mood through the position of its ears, the tension in its neck, the rhythm of its breathing. More importantly, he learned to project calm confidence even when he didn't feel it, discovering that horses responded to the energy he brought to the relationship rather than his actual skill level. "That boy's got horse sense," Pete Carson observed one spring afternoon, watching Heinrich work with a young stallion that had been giving everyone else trouble. The horse, a spirited 3-year-old named Thunder, had developed a reputation for bucking off riders and generally making life difficult for anyone who tried to train him. But with Heinrich, Thunder seemed to find a different gear entirely, responding to gentle pressure and quiet commands in ways that had surprised everyone at the camp. "Can't teach that. Either you got it or you don't, and that German boy's got it in spades." But it wasn't just Heinrich's natural skill that impressed the cowboys. It was his gentleness, his patience, and his obvious love for the animals. He never used force when finesse would work, never raised his voice when a whisper would suffice, never punished when redirection would solve the problem. His approach to horse training reflected a philosophy of cooperation rather than domination, and the results spoke for themselves. Horses that had been considered problem animals became willing partners under Heinrich's patient guidance. By summer 1944, Heinrich had become Camp Hearn's unofficial horse trainer, with local ranchers beginning to bring problem horses to the camp specifically for him to work with. They paid modest fees to the camp fund that provided extras for all the prisoners: real coffee, fresh fruit, writing materials, and small luxuries that made life more bearable. Heinrich's reputation spread throughout East Texas as the German who could gentle any horse, and requests for his services came from as far away as Dallas and Houston, carried by word of mouth through the tight network of Texas horsemen. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that surprised Heinrich. Each horse presented a unique puzzle to solve, a different combination of temperament, training, and experience that required him to adapt his approach accordingly. Some horses needed confidence building, others required discipline, and still others simply needed someone to take the time to understand what they were trying to communicate. Heinrich found that his mechanical background, his understanding of how complex systems work together, translated surprisingly well to understanding the mechanics of horse psychology and behavior. Colonel Mitchell, recognizing both the positive publicity this brought to the camp and the genuine value of Heinrich's work, made horse training an official part of the prisoner work program. Heinrich was assigned regular hours for training, given access to better equipment, and allowed to work with a wider variety of horses. The arrangement satisfied everyone involved. The local ranchers got expert training for their animals, the camp generated income and goodwill, and Heinrich found purpose and meaning in work that felt more like calling than duty. The war was turning by then, and everyone knew that the prisoners would eventually go home. News from Europe painted a picture of German defeats and Allied advances that made it clear the conflict wouldn't last much longer. The thought filled Heinrich with conflicting emotions that he struggled to articulate even to himself. He missed his mother terribly and worried about her welfare in the chaos of wartime Germany, but he had found something in Texas that he'd never known he was searching for. A sense of purpose, a community of respect and work that felt meaningful. "You've got a gift, son," Dusty told him one evening as they sat on the corral fence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed uniquely Texan in their intensity. "Don't waste it when you get home. The world needs more people who understand that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, they're partners, and horses have a way of teaching that lesson to anyone willing to listen." The conversation that evening became one of many philosophical discussions between Heinrich and his American teachers. They talked about the nature of leadership, the difference between power and authority, and the ways that working with animals could teach humans about patience, consistency, and the importance of earning trust rather than demanding obedience. These lessons, Heinrich realized, applied to much more than horse training. They were principles for rebuilding a life, a community, perhaps even a country. As autumn arrived and rumors of prisoner exchanges began to circulate through the camp, Heinrich found himself dreading the idea of leaving Texas. The irony wasn't lost on him. A German prisoner of war who had come to love his captivity and fear his freedom. But the relationships he had built, the skills he had learned, and the peace he had found at Camp Hearn represented something precious that he wasn't sure could be replicated in post-war Germany. When the day finally came for Heinrich to leave Camp Hearn in early 1945, the goodbye was harder than anyone had expected. The Cowboys gathered at sunrise to see him off, standing in the morning mist like figures from a Western movie, their hats in their hands and genuine emotion on their weathered faces. Dusty gave him a handmade rope, braided from the finest leather and crafted with the same care that Klaus had put into repairing that first saddle months earlier. Along with the rope came a battered cowboy hat that had seen better days, but still held the shape of dignity and the memory of hard work under the Texas sun. "Something to remember us by," Dusty said simply, though his voice carried the weight of everything they couldn't say about friendship across enemy lines and lessons that transcended nationality. Heinrich, whose English had become fluent during his time in Texas, struggled to find words that could express what the experience had meant to him. How do you thank someone for teaching you not just how to ride a horse, but how to find peace? How do you express gratitude for lessons about humanity that no school or church or family had ever provided? The train journey back to New York, then the ship voyage back to Germany, gave Heinrich plenty of time to reflect on his unexpected education in the heart of Texas. He carried with him not just the physical gifts from his cowboy friends, but a completely different understanding of what it meant to be strong, to be useful, to be a man worthy of respect. The gentle techniques he had learned for working with difficult horses became metaphors for approaches to human relationships, business dealings, and the countless conflicts that arise in daily life. Years later, after Heinrich had returned to Munich and slowly rebuilt his life, in the aftermath of Germany's total defeat, he would establish a horse therapy program for veterans and trauma survivors. Using the gentle techniques he'd learned from Texas cowboys, combined with his own hard-won understanding of what it meant to heal from the wounds of war, He helped hundreds of people find healing through their connection with animals. The program became a model studied throughout Europe, and Heinrich became something of a celebrity in therapeutic circles, though he always insisted that the real credit belonged to a group of American cowboys who had treated their enemies with unexpected kindness. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps Heinrich's story reach more people. And remember what war tried to erase: humanity. He never forgot the fundamental lesson that Dusty Rodriguez had taught him on that snowy Christmas morning in 1943, that respect could exist between enemies, that kindness was not weakness, and that the best way to win a war was to never forget how to make peace. The cowboy hat hung in his Munich workshop until the day he died, a constant reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and that healing often begins when we learn to see our enemies as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. In 1963, 18 years after the war ended, Heinrich received an unexpected letter from Texas. Dusty Rodriguez, now an old man himself, had written to invite Heinrich back to Camp Herne, now just a memory and some foundation stones, for a reunion of the men who had shared that unique experience. Heinrich made the journey, bringing his wife and teenage son, to meet the people who had shaped his understanding of what America could be at its best. The reunion lasted a week, filled with stories, laughter, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from seeing how seeds of kindness planted in wartime had grown into forests of friendship that spanned decades and continents. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy, and remember that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always people willing to choose understanding over hatred, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair.